I think they were quite right, though, in saying that man's highest happiness is in sharing happiness with others, that's observably true. And to set that as a social goal was, I suppose, in some ways radical in its day, and has represented some of the best things in this nation and in other nations that have followed.
Journalist, critic, scholar, teacher, columnist, author, Garry Wills talks about inventing America. I'm Bill Moyers. With night coming, we moved inside to finish our conversation in Thomas Jefferson's bedroom.
What do you think he meant when he said, much later, that the Declaration expressed an American mind?
Well, I suppose that a half century later, when, by the way, his memory was very bad over most of the testable events that we can check on, that a half a century later he wanted to say, to the charge of plagiarism, that he was not foisting on the American Revolution some private little theory of his own, but was going along with the development of a consensus. And it was a development. You have to remember that from 1765, the Stamp Act, there was terrific, speedy growth and change of arguments. For instance, I was taught in schools, I suppose you were, that the revolution was fought over the issue of taxation without representation. It wasn't at all. That was an issue that was settled in 1765, and nobody wanted to bring it up again. John Adams said in 1775, for God's sake, don't bring that up. They might give us representation. We don't want that. We don't want members in Parliament. That was an issue that had completely dropped out of people's minds. There was a terrific pressure forcing men to grow, to change their views. The foremost spokesmen of 1765 were suspect as old fogies by 1776. John Dickinson, for instance, or Richard Bland. These were people whose day was over in 10 years. So rapid was the pace of events. Jefferson himself said in 1775, I would rather be ruled by the King of England than by any other king or than by no king. So 1 year before the Declaration, he was saying he would prefer to have a king.
Sound like a Tory.
Yeah. 1765, Pennsylvania petitioned the king to grant them status as a royal colony, not a proprietary. They wanted to be under the king. 1767, the New Yorkers put up a gold statue to the king. I think it's Richard B. Morris has said that one of the fascinating things is about the American Revolution is the rapid disappearance of monarchic feelings after 1776, because they were very pronounced right down to the wire in 1776. But again, you have to remember that everybody was undergoing a kind of mutual education process. John Adams said that at the outset of the Continental Congress, a third of the Americans were patriots for independence, a third were loyalists, and a third were apathetic. And even in the third that were patriots, there was tremendous division on the timing, the logistics, the strategy, whether to accept reconciliation, on what terms to accept reconciliation. So there was no American mind because flux and change were forcing everybody to change, everybody to undergo tremendous rapid growth.
What do you mean when you talk about the lost world of Thomas Jefferson?
Well, Jefferson has been very well studied from the 1780s on, but he was very poorly studied during that most formative time of his life, 1760s, when he was in school, when his principal teachers and the people he owed most to in the intellectual world were dealing with him. And that happened because of a concatenation of accidents. His plantation with all of his library and all of his early writings burnt down in 1770.
The one that was just
at the foot of this hill, his father's plantation that he had inherited. He was 27 years old. He had been intensely trained by some very intelligent, bright people. He had, we presume, gone through all of the adolescent writings of a brilliant man, poetry, and one book that was saved from that fire shows that he wrote marginal notations in his books. All of that was lost. Then his tutor, who was a brilliant man in his own right, died before he was 40, went back to Birmingham and was lost to history. If he had lived, he would have been a very famous man.
This was William Small.
William Small. who taught him at William and Mary. The records of William and Mary College have been destroyed. The school that was predominant in American educational circles in the 1760s has dropped out of history because people have lost interest in that particular approach to ethics. So if you put all those things together, you realize that in the 1760s, when Jefferson was imbibing the kinds of things that Small was teaching and that were being taught in all the American colleges in the 1760s, you see that he went into the 1770s when he wrote the Declaration, when he wrote the Notes on the State of Virginia, before he went to France, with a whole world that is not explored if you pick him up in France in the 1780s, or if you pick him up in Philadelphia in the 1790s.
When you put this lost world back together, what were the dominant forces in it, the forces that you think intellectually shaped Jefferson?
Well, in the English-speaking world in general, in the middle of the 18th century, the Scottish philosophers had assumed tremendous importance. Oxford and Cambridge were comparatively somnolent, and a whole sequence of brilliant people at Edinburgh and Glasgow, Aberdeen, had faced up to what was the most serious intellectual challenge of their day, namely, if you accept the mechanistic world of Newtonian physics and Lockean sensation, how is it possible for man to be free, and how is it possible for man to exercise altruistic instincts? If man is a kind of billiard ball, kicked around by pleasure and pain, and responding to it in a determined way, as Locke had said, then how can he be virtuous? How can he rise above simple mechanistic response to pleasure and pain? There's a tremendously serious problem. Mandeville, Hobbes, and others had said that he couldn't, that that's all he was a kind of pleasure-pain machine. And the answer to that, which seized the imagination of all of Europe, the French, the Swiss, the English, was given in 1725 by Francis Hutcheson, who took the billiard ball world and...
He was a Scot.
Yes, he was a Scot. He went to Glasgow and, in a way, launched the Scottish Enlightenment in 1730. He took this billiard ball world and he said, but if you look at it, you do have pleasure, which is not of a selfish sort, in aesthetic contemplation. You see things, you enjoy them, not in a rapacious way, and you want to prolong that enjoyment, you want to share it. The more people see the beautiful thing with you, the more your pleasure. And the way you share it is by propagating it, by imitating rhythm and grace and beauty in your life, therefore the civilizing results of the arts. He said the same thing is true of benevolence. We are pleased at the mere sight of somebody doing good to another person. He said we cheer the hero, we hiss the villain. So that school, which as I say has dropped out of...
moral sense school, it came to be known, didn't it?
Right. He said that that appetite you have to enjoy benevolence and prolong it is a moral sense. He says everybody has it the way they have an arm. It's a separate faculty. It's not simply an exercise of some of the faculties you have, intellect or will or whatever. It's a separate faculty, and it's the highest faculty in man.
How do you know that Thomas Jefferson was directly influenced by the Scottish moral philosophers, and what significance did that influence have for him?
Well, we know that he was because he gives an exposition of moral sense thinking as early as 1771, before the Declaration, in his letter to Robert Skipwith, as early as 1781, before he went to France, in his Notes on the State of Virginia, which were written then, though published later when he went to France. He continued it all through his life. There are two other letters that are very important expositions of the sound Scottish view of the moral sense, where he talks about its acting automatically and being a function of every man and being equal. And right to the very end of his life, when he was corresponding with John Adams, Jefferson was very taken with the French school, the new school then, of idéologues, Destutt de Tracy, for instance. And yet, even though he was friendly with them and agreed with them on everything else, he said that they were quite wrong in thinking that there was no separate faculty called the moral sense. So, from the earliest time we can pick him up, a year after the fire at Shadwell, straight through his life, he believed in the moral sense.
And what did it mean to him?
Well, the impact on him was immense. It meant, among other things, that he considered men naturally sociable, that they didn't have to bargain into society from a kind of selfish vantage point.
Which was the Lockean route.
At least one popular view of the Lockean attitude, that you don't contract interest over against interest and arrive at society by a kind of jujitsu of selfishness on selfishness, going from individualism to society. The Scots all said, you begin with society. Hume made fun of the idea of the original contract. He said, we're social before we're anything else. We're members of a family. We start communicating, and communication is itself an act of trust. It's an acceptance of social conventions of language. And so, in their view, society didn't have to be created by man, and didn't come from selfish instinct and from property. Society was given.
This is one of the reasons, isn't it, that Jefferson admired Indian society. It had a sense of cohesion, it had a respect of one for another that he thought was quite admirable.
Yes, he said that they didn't need a lot of institutions because they wanted to be in each other's good grace. They were what a modern anthropologist would call a shame society. That is, if an Indian orator gets up and says that's beneath you, then the person will automatically reform because they don't want anybody to think bad of them. Well, that was what Jefferson thought, very close to the natural social instinct, and so he did hold Indians in very high esteem.
You have a paragraph in your book which says, quote, "This moral sense gives man his unique dignity. It grounds his rights. It makes him self-governing. It is man's highest faculty, the basis of his moral accountability and the bond with other men. Thus, it had to be the basis, in Jefferson's view, for man's politics and political right." What do you mean it had to be, the moral sense had to be the basis for our politics?
Well, if you and I are in a political order and I say we must do such and such because it is right and good, obviously I have no way to force you to do that unless I can appeal to the faculty for discerning what is right and moral and good in you. The same way as I say you cannot bind a person to observe a law unless you believe that he has responsibility to himself and to others. The moral sense is what tells you that you should do good, that you should enter into kindly intercourses with your fellows. And therefore, all social action follows on that. So that the pursuit of happiness, for instance, is another manifestation of this pursuit of benevolence, because to be benevolent and see benevolence is to have the highest happiness. So the very forces that get you into motion in social intercourse with other people are the ones that give you the highest satisfaction. They're the ones that most fit your nature, the best thing in you, the part of you that is most noble, most responsive to everyone else's solicitings of good.
Is this what Jefferson meant when he referred to a society based on ties of affections?
Yes. His own theory of the Revolution was that once Americans left England to go to the colonies, they really owed nothing to the mother parliament. He said that the Americans decided to adopt a common king out of affection for their brethren. They wanted to keep that tie with the British at home, who had been the society in which they had been formed. And he said that only those brethren could destroy that bond by not acting like brethren, by themselves inflicting non-affectionate actions upon them. And of course that's what happened, he said, in the whole course of parliamentary intrusions on colonial right. So that his own climax to the Declaration of Independence, which was excised by Congress, said that not only has the king not answered our petitions, not only has the parliament kept on infringing our rights, which were the subject of the petition, but the British people have supported the king in sending Scotch and other mercenaries to fight against their kindred, and the British people have returned to Parliament, the same people who were making these infringements of our rights. Therefore, this has delivered the last stab to agonizing affection, and we do renounce these unfeeling brethren. That was his Declaration of Independence.
From the people of England?
From the people of England.
In the context of the moral sense school, what do you think Jefferson meant when he said, quote, "all men are created equal"?
Obviously, he meant they have an equal moral sense. The noblest faculty in them is equal, therefore, any differences in inferior faculties are comparatively unimportant. The moral sense is in some way or other inhibited by lack of information, by lack of exercise. As Jefferson would say, everybody's given equal legs, but if you lie shackled for the first 12 years of your life, you're not going to be able to use them very well. The particular case he took up in great detail of an apparently impaired moral sense was that of the slaves. He specifically says the slaves have the gifts of the heart, of the affection, of benevolence, and he lists the virtues that come directly from moral sense: gratitude, benevolence, and he says, now, unfortunately, slaves steal a lot, which was true, by the way. It was a tribute to their independence that they had a kind of underground network. The slaves were not entirely beaten down, and it's a sign of their nobility, even in slavery.
At least of their ingenuity.
Yeah, and he said that doesn't count because the moral sense is not allowed to operate in a society where there is no reciprocity of obligation.
They steal because of their condition, not because of their nature.
Absolutely, absolutely. That doesn't mean that the moral sense, removed from this unnaturally inhibiting atmosphere, would not regain total equality, and that's what he said. And when he said that slaves should be trained for freedom, he wanted them taken as children away from the atmosphere in which they had been corrupted in this one respect, so that they would grow up with their moral sense unimpaired. He had no doubt that they had that moral sense, that it was equal to white men's.
So when Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," he meant in effect that for all the differences between you and me in age, education, experience,
Intellect.
we are equal in our moral faculty.
Right.
Our capacity to
see and to do good.
Well, if we accept, as you think Jefferson did accept, the reality of our equality in the possession of a moral faculty, that we are equal morally, what follows from that politically and practically?
Part of our problem is that if we read Jefferson properly, we can't read him anachronistically. We have to read him in the world of science that existed at the time, which is a quite different world from ours. His was a mechanical world, not a chemical world. It was not a physical world in the sense of our physics. It was much more a dynamics world. But if we step outside that, I think that certain analogs to his thought can be adopted today. For instance, if you begin with the idea that the law is made simply to protect the individual and his rights, and he begins thinking about his rights over against everybody else's rights, you have made society almost impossible. You're trying to do the paradoxical, to create society out of selfishness. How can you create unity out of division? If you begin by saying that man's natural world is a world of giving and sharing, then the kinds of arrangements you make in society will be divisions of labor to bring out the virtue within people. And again, I don't want to be as entirely optimistic as Jefferson was. I don't believe, as I think he did believe, that man, with all of the problems of superstition and want and ignorance, etc., removed, is always totally benevolent. I don't think that there's a mystery of evil within man which Jefferson somewhat tended to downplay. It's a much better world view if you start out thinking that man's happiness does come from society. He is formed by society. He never exists in some hypothetical state of nature. We all depend upon each other. And if that's the case, then the proper way to go about politics is to divide labor in a way that allows everybody to make their own contribution with maximum freedom. And that's, of course, what Jefferson largely meant by pursuit of happiness, that man pursues happiness as a stone falls. The stone won't fall if you impose some obstacle in its way. And he thinks that that's what many governments, much religion, much education had done before that. He says, if you take away all of these stones and allow the stone, these obstacles and allow the stone to fall, if you take away from man the inhibitions on his marvelous energy of benevolence, then everyone in the pursuit of happiness will promote happiness. And that formula is, again, something that is in Hume and Hutcheson, that the maximum pursuit of happiness will amount to the maximum promotion of happiness for everybody. In other words, you're not thinking of happiness as a zero-sum thing, and what I take out of the pot is denied to other people. Happiness grows by, for the community by growing it within the individual, if it's virtuous happiness.
What do you think Jefferson meant by happiness before we get to the pursuit of it?
The fulfillment of nature, the ability to follow the promptings of nature.
What do you mean?
Well, hap of itself means fit, happenstance, and what haps. And happy is something that fits a person's nature. He says it's the nature of man to know, for instance. And so obstacles, censorship, the refusal of literacy to various classes, all of those things thwart that pursuit of happiness, which is an obvious inbuilt energy of man. And you're fighting nature when you in any way inhibit man's pursuit of knowledge. So he said the job of society is for all of our good and our mutual satisfaction to remove as many obstacles as we can in the way of man's pursuit of knowledge.
And in other pursuits too.
Sure, but then you have to remember that he did not think that the pursuit of selfishness was a real satisfaction. The highest happiness is benevolence. And if you don't know that, then again, you're ignorant. You're operating under an inhibition. So that insofar as people begin to know and experience and measure and evaluate happiness, they will realize that virtue is the highest happiness. If I'm not alive, if I'm not free, I can't do good for others. Their argument against slavery was that it took away from a man the right to be benevolent. A slave didn't have any free will, so you took away from him his highest faculty, the right to do good to others.
How do you explain Jefferson's continuing to hold on to his slaves when he was so obviously influenced by the moral school?
He was, and by the way, they were much more advanced than the Lockeans in their attitude towards slavery. Hutcheson, for instance, entirely repudiated Locke's view that a captive in war could be held as a slave. He thought that slaves should be freed, but he thought that there were so many mutual wrongs inflicted between blacks and whites that the affection necessary for single society was not there, so they would have to be deported. They would have to go somewhere else and be free. This doesn't say they're inferior. He thought that Americans and the British had to be separated because of the infliction of unfeeling acts upon brethren.
But wasn't he granting the blacks their rights as a people, but not as individuals? When
Well,
he took that
as I
position?
say, there is no such thing as an individual in the world. They have to have a community. And that, bring it down to practical matters. Jefferson, as a matter of law and economics, could not free his slaves. In Virginia, you could not just free a slave if you wanted to, for a lot of reasons. For one thing, some masters would obviously say, fine, I'll free the sick, the ill, the drones, the rebellious, the troublemakers. I'll just free them. I won't have to support them. And it's been estimated that a good deal of the time, at least a third of the slave force were unproductive. You had to take care of the ones who were old, sick, infants, nursing, etc. So what would you do with these slaves? Just free them? They would be preying on society or preyed upon by it. They'd be destroyed. All right, then say you want to free a slave of sound mind and body. What do you do? How do you do that? In Jefferson's day, you had to go down to the courthouse right here in Charlottesville, the one that's standing there, and you had to prove that you had given that person a trade and a place to exercise it, or money to get out, because there was no place for such a slave to go. There were no towns or ports in Virginia. There was no proletariat. Virginia lived on the great plantations along the rivers. When you set a slave free, where would he work? What would he do? Whom would he marry? How would he bring up his children? So, in order to free the slave, you had to have capital. You have to have invested capital in him and giving him a skill and the means to exercise it, or in giving him money. Now, Jefferson had at one time over 200 slaves, but his only capital was his land. His land was worthless without cheap labor. So if he wanted to free his slaves, what would he put up as capital? His land? His land had no value without the slaves. He was in a vicious circle. Correct. So it was against the laws of Virginia for him to free more than a handful of slaves that he could have got together the capital for. Now, he thought that piecemeal emancipation was, in the long run, harmful, that the free man was not wanted anywhere. He was feared even more by small landholders than by big ones. To be a free man in Virginia in those days, you really had to bear arms. You had to hunt and you had to defend yourself. They didn't want blacks bearing arms. And anyone who did that would find themselves in very great trouble very fast.
His answer, theoretically, was to deport them, to send them back.
He said, you have to collect the money through taxation and other means, form a school to train every slave born after date certain, train them up to freedom, and allow them to go off someplace that Virginia would get, and let them grow up, and let their parents die off on the plantations, supported to their death by the plantation owners. And that's an interesting thing. It's another example of his belief in the cohesiveness and the ethos of a society, that he wanted to launch this brave new society of blacks, to grow up free, to be trained to freedom, and not to have memories of slavery. And so the old people would have to die off and be supported by the plantation owners, although it was obviously not to their advantage to have non-productive slaves living on for some years. He said that in order to do that, they would have to bring in white laborers, indentured laborers. So it was a very complex scheme. He spelled it out in great detail in his Notes on Virginia, which was addressed to the French as a very enlightened document, which he tried to prove that Americans have the most enlightened view of society. So he thought it was a very good scheme. He supported it all his life. He never was in favor of piecemeal or individual manumission.
Does this kind of examination of the world of Jefferson lead us closer to an egalitarian society?
Well, I would hope. In the 19th century, in the Industrial Revolution, the costs of rapid expansion were so obvious that the sentimental school, the benevolent school, rebelled against some of the ruthlessness of progress. And they got pushed aside by the classical liberals, and the benevolent school faded off into romanticism of the Carlyle, Ruskin, William Morris, Keats, Shelley sort. The brotherhood of man became a kind of ineffectual thing. And industrialism became a matter of ruthless competition, individualism, Darwinian survival of the fittest, social Darwinism. So that whole trauma of the Industrial Revolution occurring in England and in America made people suspect fraternity as kind of soft and dreamy and not able to survive in the workaday world. And I think that our politics is not, that doesn't really represent our politics any more than the 18th century picture. Our politics is really a matter not so much of competition but of compromise. Our politicians are, in that sense, they don't rise to this disinterested virtue, but they do try to mute hostilities, to lessen differences. The great gift of a politician is to prevent divisiveness, to be a social glue. And so in an odd way, they do work for the common good and not for the private good. But to make a comparison of that sort, we would have to go into so many differences and similarities. But what I'm saying is that the ideal of fraternity was there. It's a recoverable ideal in many respects, it seems to me. And Americans actually do feel a bond with each other, which is deeper than law, which is based on shared experiences, loved things. Why do people respond to the flag, to appeals to their better nature? Not because there's a law that says they have to do that. In the Federalist Papers, Madison said, we're asking you to accept a Constitution. You can find every kind of way that that Constitution might offend you. But if you look at every law that way, we'd never have any law. He said you have to look to the basic comity, the amity that it can exist between men.
You've got a new book, The Confessions of a Conservative. You consider yourself a conservative.
Sure. I consider myself conservative because the American political system operates conservatively. It operates to hold the community together. There's no time when the community is more united than the end of an election, no matter how strenuously fought, no matter how close the margin of victory afterward. One of the things that's fascinating to me is that when people say a political campaign, a presidential campaign is full of silly debate and no issues and all that kind of thing, they're quite true. And yet to follow one around, as I have several times, follow candidates through, is to see a great ritual of togetherness. The political campaign becomes a kind of national rite of renewal. Not so much because of what's said, as by the coming together of everybody, wanting to say that this is the best kind of government we can hope for, that we're striving to achieve, and among other things, just enjoying each other's company. There's a lot of fun in a political convention. It's, of course, our great sports event, too. It's the one thing that everybody participates in or watches in some measure more than any World Series or Super Bowl or whatever. So I find all of this very conservative in a nonpartisan sense, but in a very obvious sense. There's nothing doctrinaire or weird about that, I think.
Were the moral philosophers, including Thomas Jefferson, wrong about human nature? Were they wrong about our capacity to be benevolent toward one another?
Well, I don't think they were entirely right. I think, as I said, there is a kind of mysterious evil in man that accounts for Calvinist and other views of man, which also have their validity. I think they were quite right, though, in saying that man's highest happiness is in sharing happiness with others, that's observably true. And to set that as a social goal was, I suppose, in some ways radical in its day, and has represented some of the best things in this nation and in other nations that have followed.
How do you think Jefferson might regard our society today in this light? Would he smile on it?
I hope so. I think he would approve of as much in this society as he did in the society of his day. He'd love the technology and the science. I think he would understand the limits of politics. He certainly experienced some of those himself. And he saw that the nation is not the same as its government. A people is not the same thing as its institutions. That there is a comity, an energy of life shared underneath all those things, which keeps them going, not vice versa.
From Monticello, this has been a conversation with Garry Wills, author of Inventing America. I'm Bill Moyers.
This program was made possible by grants from the Ford Foundation and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.